In Hereditary, we follow a family plagued by supernatural forces after the death of their grandmother. By the end, the family comes to realize that they have inherited more from the matriarch than they had hoped. After 78-year-old Lee passes away, her daughter Annie is shocked to find so many people in attendance to her funeral. For her entire life, Annie hadn't been aware of her mother's popularity. Growing up, the two had never been close. For as long as she'd known her mother, Lee had always been a secretive and private woman. Their relationship was so stifled that Annie didn't even want her mom near her first child Peter, who is now 16 years old. Things didn't get better until after her second child Charlie was born. While snacking away on a chocolate bar, 13-year-old Charlie grows curious of her grandmother's strange and mysterious guests. She watches as they caress her grandmother's dead lips and how they smile at Charlie from the corners of the room when she catches their eye. As the funeral comes to an end, Charlie's father, whose name's Steve, approaches her and asks if her snack has nuts in it. Charlie says no. Her family is relieved because Charlie is deathly allergic and they didn't bring her EpiPen to the funeral. Annie is a miniature dollhouse maker who often works on personal projects that reflect what happens in her real life. As the idea of her mother's death becomes more real, she's confused why she isn't sadder. Her mother had just passed away. This should be one of the worst moments of her life, yet she isn't fazed by it.
Should I be sadder? You should be whatever you are.
Since Charlie had been the closest with Lee, Annie thinks her daughter is devastated after losing her grandmother. To make her feel better, Annie decides to comfort Charlie while tucking her in for bed. Annie tells Charlie that she'd always been her grandmother's favorite. This was made evident since Lee would often care for Charlie, even going so far as refusing to let Annie feed her while she was a baby. Charlie is sad to admit that her grandmother always wanted her to be a boy. Annie sees this as an opportunity to get Charlie to release some of the emotions she'd been holding in all her life. As a baby, Charlie never cried, and as she grew, she never expressed emotion, which has caused her to almost express herself through random clicking noises. Now that Charlie is facing this tragedy, Charlie hasn't even shed a tear, and Annie thinks this is kind of weird. While going through her mom's things, Annie stumbles across a note written by her mother. The letter is addressed to Annie. In the letter, her mother asks her not to hate her, and that all the sacrifices they made will be worth it in the end. At school, a bird smashes into the window while Charlie is doing a test. After mutilating the bird and storing its head in her pocket, Charlie spots a strange woman waving and smiling at her from across the street. That night, Steve receives a call from the cemetery informing him that someone had desecrated Lee's grave. In an attempt to make sense of her emotions, Annie attends a support group for people who've lost loved ones. She tells the group about her strained relationship with her mother, along with her tragic family history. Not only did her father starve himself to death, but her older brother also committed suicide. According to Annie, her older brother suffered from schizophrenia, and before he died, he accused his mother of trying to put people inside of him. After this tragedy, Steve allowed Lee to live with them. This was a big step in Lee and Annie's relationship because before this, there was a no contact rule. Because of this rule, Annie never let her mother near Peter, who was her first child. After her brother's suicide, Annie felt bad for being so distant. Her mother had lived a tragic life. The least she could do was understand why she was the way she was. Wanting to turn over a new leaf, Annie allowed her mother near Charlie, whom she immediately took control over. Some time passes and their lives are slowly going back to normal. When Peter gets invited to a party, he asks his mom if he could use the car. Annie gives him permission under the condition that he doesn't drink and that he also brings his sister with him. Even though Charlie doesn't want to go to the party, Annie forces her, claiming that it will be a good opportunity for her to socialize with other kids. At the party, Peter attempts to get his crush's attention, and when she invites him into another room, Peter leaves Charlie by herself. While Charlie waits for her brother, Charlie snacks on a cake that, unbeknownst to her, contains nuts. The effects quickly take hold on Charlie, causing her to suffer from an allergic reaction that restricts her breathing. The moment Peter discovers what's happening, he takes his sister and leaves the party. Peter is booking it down the pitch-black freeway. At the same time, Charlie's symptoms are getting worse. Desperate for air, she rolls down the back window and pokes her head out into the open freeway. A dog sitting in the middle of the road startles Peter, causing him to lose control of the car. The car passes by a telephone pole as it swerves off the road. Charlie's head is taken clean off her body as her outstretched neck connects with the pole. Peter is in shock over what just happened, and instead of calling for help, he heads home and goes straight to bed. He lays awake long enough to hear his mother's reaction after finding a headless Charlie in the backseat of her car. Personally, I think this was mighty fucked up of Peter. He could have just gone to the hospital, but you know what? Moving on. After Charlie's death, the family's life begins to spiral. Both Annie and the father are a wreck after losing their youngest child. At the same time, Peter blames himself for Charlie's death and suffers from PTSD. One day, Annie meets a lady named Joan in the grocery store parking lot who tells her that she'd lost a child as well. After bonding over this shared experience, Joan gives Annie her number. When the two meet up, Annie tells Joan about the time she found her daughter's headless body. When asked about her relationship with her other child, Peter, Annie explains the backstory behind their stifled relationship. Annie used to sleepwalk when the children were younger. One night, she woke up to find herself and her children covered in paint thinner. She'd been standing over Peter's body with a lit match in her hand, ready to light him on fire, but immediately extinguished the flame the moment she came to her senses. This event caused friction in their relationship, causing them to argue on a regular basis and become tense around one another. Even though Annie doesn't admit it, part of her resents Peter for what he's done. Their already tense relationship, along with Peter's inability to acknowledge or even apologize for his part in Charlie's death, causes Annie to lash out at him during family dinner.
If you could have just said, "I'm sorry," or faced up to what happened, maybe then we could do something with this, but you can't take responsibility for anything! So now I can't accept.
Although Annie may somewhat blame Peter for Charlie's death, Peter blames Annie. The way Peter sees it, Charlie didn't even want to go to the party, but Annie had forced her. Had Annie just let Charlie stay home like she wanted to, she'd be alive today. Time passes before Annie bumps into Joan while exiting the grocery store, but this time when they meet, Joan's mood has done a complete 180. Not only is Joan happier, but she's filled with excitement from the results she'd had with the medium. According to Joan, she visited a medium who helped her get in contact with her son's spirit. Knowing that Annie is suffering a similar loss, Joan insists that Annie try it out for herself. After a little convincing, Joan invites Annie over and shows her how to conduct a seance to connect with Charlie's spirit. Annie is hesitant at first, but is shocked after witnessing the impossible. Not only do objects start moving on their own, but the spirit of Joan's son begins writing on a chalkboard right before their very eyes. Before Annie heads home, Joan gives her everything she needs to conduct her own seance. That night, Annie has a dream where she sleepwalks into Peter's room and admits that she tried to have a miscarriage while pregnant with him. In that dream, she admits that she's happy her mother forced her to give birth because despite their strained relationship, she still loves him. The dream ends as he bursts into flames, demanding to know why she doesn't love him. At this point, Annie is desperate. With Joan's seance idea fresh in her mind, she gathers her family into one room to conduct the seance. The results are shocking. Not only does a glass move on its own, but Charlie herself begins speaking through her mom, as if she's inhabiting her mother's body. Instead of being excited, this freaks her family out, causing Steve to throw water in Annie's face, which cuts off the spiritual connection. At school, a light that only Peter can see bounces across the room, and when Peter catches his own reflection smiling at him, he becomes convinced that a vengeful spirit is following him. Steve is enraged when he finds out just how badly everything is taking a toll on his son, and he warns Annie that whatever she's doing is ruining their family. Enraged over everything, Annie trashes her art room, but her rage morphs into astonishment when she finds Charlie's pen drawing in her notebook by itself. That night, Peter has a nightmare of Charlie watching him from the corner of his room, just as a pair of hands began pulling at his head. He wakes up to his mom collecting laundry in his room and becomes convinced that she was the one trying to pull his head off while he slept. She reassures him that she would never do such a thing and asks Peter not to tell his dad about his dream. Understanding what's going on, Annie explains that she's the only one who can stop the spiritual activity from ruining their lives. Determined to free her family from these spiritual clutches, Annie attempts to burn Charlie's notebook, but her shirt catches on fire, while Charlie's notebook goes up in flames. Her attempts to extinguish them fails until she realizes that the flames on her sleeve and the flames on the notebook have formed some sort of connection. Finally, she realizes that the only way to keep herself from burning is to put out the fire on the notebook as well. Desperate for answers to her spiritual problem, Annie heads to Joan's house, but Joan isn't home. The audience is then shown a view inside of Joan's home. At her table is a shrine that appears as if Joan had been in the middle of conducting her own seance. Peter's picture sits in the middle of the table, surrounded by items needed to conduct a spell. Before Annie turns away, she notices that Joan's welcome mat is awfully similar to the ones her mom used to handmade. Peter is eating lunch lunch at school when he notices Joan calling him from across the street. This scene is a direct parallel to the scene in the beginning when a mystery lady had been trying to get Charlie's attention. Annie heads home and finds a book on demon possession while looking through her mother's things. The page marked by her mother is about the demon named King Payman, along with instructions on how to allow him to enter into a human body. Along with this book, she finds a photo album filled with pictures of her mother and people she has never seen before. Things get weirder when she comes across a picture of her mother and Joan together, and when she finds a picture of her mother in a white dress being fawned over by this mysterious crowd, she knows something is terribly off. Annie heads into the attic and finds her mother's body hidden in the corner. The symbol from her mother's possession book is drawn over her body. In the meantime, Peter is at school when he hears Charlie's familiar tongue clicking. His muscles suddenly seize as he slams his face into the desk and breaks his own nose. Peter is sent home from school. After Steve pulls into the driveway, Annie helps him bring an unconscious Peter into the home. After tucking Peter into bed, Annie tells Steve about finding a body in the attic. She explains that she believes it's her mother, but she can't be sure because the head is gone and the body is decaying. Steve doesn't believe her at first, but once he sees the body for himself, he becomes worried that Annie is the one who desecrated her mother's grave. Annie tries to explain that all the weird things happening are because they invited something into their home when conducting the seance, and that the only way to save Peter is to burn Charlie's drawing book, which is filled with drawings of Peter. Annie begs her husband to throw the book into the fire, and when he refuses, she does it instead. This time, her husband is the one who erupts into flames. Peter heads downstairs to find his father's charred remains. A possessed Annie watches him from the ceiling, while a naked person watches on from the corner of the room. His mother and grandmother's headless bodies are kneeling before the statue. When he turns around, Annie chases him into the attic where he finds the outline of a body drawn inside of a circle of candles with his picture in the middle. Frightened from seeing more random naked people in the corner of his attic, Peter jumps out of the window. When he awakes, he sees Annie's headless body floating up into Charlie's treehouse. He follows his mother's corpse into the treehouse and finds a statue with Charlie's head propped onto the neck. When he turns around, his mom is hovering from the ceiling, slicing through her own neck with wire. A group of naked people are kneeling before him. Joan places a crown atop his head and announces his new name. She calls him Payman and explains that they have corrected his prior female body by finding him a new host. The movie ends as the rest of the clergy hails Payman. Hereditary gives a disturbing take on inheritance and how sometimes displeasing traits, items, and beliefs are passed down from generation to generation. Just like the title of the film suggests, something is being passed down through a bloodline. In this case, it's the demon Payman, as well as the knowledge and practice of the occult. Lee and her husband took on this practice and became so engrossed with their beliefs that they willingly passed it on to their children. However, their children didn't understand what was happening, and because of this, they didn't share their parents' belief. This caused a wedge in their relationships and prohibited Lee and her husband from transferring this hereditary trait onto their children. As a result, it successfully skipped a generation and moved on to their grandchildren, who ultimately fulfilled their grandparents' goals through Peter's possession. This movie may seem confusing at first, but understanding some clues and context make it easier to understand. Let's start with the suicide of Annie's brother for one. She had claimed he was mentally unstable and depressed, and even accused his mother of trying to put people inside of him. So when he committed suicide, she was shocked, but I doubt she was surprised. By the end, when the truth is revealed behind Annie's mother and father's true intentions, it becomes clear that her brother was not in fact mentally unstable like everyone was being led to believe. The mother had actually been trying to put people inside of him, specifically the demon Payman. She had tried to use her own son as a human vessel, but he hadn't allowed her to do so. We have no idea how long Lee had been trying to possess her son with a demon, but we can assume she'd been trying his entire life. Just like with Peter, she had to wait until the body matured. But since the son knew what was going on, he decided to stop her in the only way he knew how, by taking his own life and getting rid of the vessel she planned on using. In the movie, Annie explained that because of their strained relationship, she never let her mother near Peter when he was a child. This upset her mother because she no longer had a vessel for Payman. When Annie finally allowed her mother to be in her life when Charlie was born, her mother jumped at the opportunity to give Payman a body, regardless of the gender. Understanding that Payman is male, Lee knew he needed a male host. So she waited until Peter was old enough, and when the time came, her clan got got rid of the old host, which was Charlie, but worked on obtaining the one they really wanted, which came in the form of Peter. At one point, Charlie tells her mom that her grandmother wanted her to be a boy. At first, Annie doesn't understand this. From what she understood, Charlie had been her grandmother's favorite. But looking back, we know that Charlie had been telling the truth. Had Charlie been a boy, there would be no need for Peter's involvement in this ritual. Lee would have just latched onto Charlie and that would have been that. But Charlie being a girl made things more difficult and forced her to rectify what she deemed was a mistake. In the end, it might not have made a difference anyway. The family still would have been dead because Lee needed them to sacrifice themselves in order to please Payman. Charlie is often associated with bird imagery. She has a treehouse that looks like a birdhouse. She collects trinkets and objects that can be explained as things she uses for her art, but also kinda reminds me of birds collecting random objects to build their nests. One of the most significant bird imageries in the film is when a bird slams into the window while she's writing her quiz at school. Another is when she cuts its head off during recess. After she dies, bird imagery is seen once again when her father is going through her drawing notebook after her funeral. Birds are a common symbol of flight and moving on. Perhaps the bird symbolizes Payman. He resides in Charlie's body, but is letting her know that it is soon time for him to make his move to another host. In Charlie's last drawing, she draws a bird with a crown on its head. This foreshadows her fate. Just like the bird, Charlie will also lose her head, but in her death, she will wear a crown. When she cuts the bird's head off and places it in her pocket, perhaps that is her subconsciously collecting an offering for the demon inside of her. She places it in her pocket, meaning she wanted to keep it for herself. But because Payman resides inside of her, she had collected it for him before turning into the ultimate sacrifice. Fire is used as symbolism throughout Hereditary. One of the most significant ways it's used is when Annie shares a dream where she had poured paint thinner over her children, but awoke before she dropped a lit match on them. It's seen once again when she throws Charlie's notebook into the fire, only for the fire to spread onto her the longer the notebook is lit. By the end, it's seen when Annie finally throws Charlie's notebook in the fire, only for her husband to erupt into flames. In occult practices, fire is used to invoke a ritual. The use of fire in these instances can symbolize the occurrence of a ritual taking place. Because Lee had ensured that a demonic presence was with her family at all times, perhaps the presence or mention of fire showed that the ritual she started with her own son was ongoing. This would explain the beam of light that followed Charlie and Peter throughout the film. Since fire is a symbolism for light, this may be a representation of Payman's presence. He showed himself through light, and perhaps he made himself known through fire. Since he didn't have a physical body, he was forced to show himself in other ways. Annie's dollhouses are also common symbolism throughout Hereditary. Throughout the movie, Annie uses her dollhouses as a way to reenact important memories in her life. The first dollhouse is seen in the beginning when the audience first enters the home through Peter's room. This is the first way the audience is shown that Annie and her family are the dolls in Hereditary. Their lives had been mapped out for them without their knowledge. Regardless of the choices they made, they were destined to be sacrifices for Payman. Another dollhouse showed Lee standing over Annie after she gave birth to Charlie. This symbolized how her mother had always been in control of her daughter and granddaughter. Lee always kept a watchful eye over Charlie and Annie. And from the moment of her birth, Lee had already decided that Charlie would become a vessel for her demonic lord. It also showed that Lee had always been in control of her daughter and grandchildren. For Charlie, Lee latched onto her the moment she was born and constantly looked down on Annie. Lee didn't believe that Annie was worthy of raising this holy vessel, so Lee believed she had no choice but to take control of her daughter and granddaughter's lives. By the end, the audience learns that Charlie had always been seen as a doll to Lee. Not only did Lee play with her granddaughter's life, but she viewed Charlie as disposable once Peter came of age. At one point, Annie creates a reenactment of Charlie's accident, showing that subconsciously, she understood that the accident was just a part of the story. Even though a part of her blamed Peter, nobody except the cult was at fault. Charlie's death had always been destined for her. The moment her grandmother sank her claws into Charlie, it was understood that she was never going to live out a full life. Annie knew there was something off about her mother, but she never would have guessed what Lee's true intentions were. In the end, the dollhouses show the lack of control the family had over their own predetermined fates. And unfortunately, Annie didn't understand what her subconscious was trying to reveal to her until it was too late. In the end, Hereditary shows the sad tale of a family whose fate had already been determined for them. Even though they tried to avoid the inevitable, they still ended up where the spiritual forces wanted them to be. From Lee's inception into the cult, she always had a plan to give Payman a physical body, and in the end, she had succeeded. In the note she left behind for her daughter, she asks Annie not to hate her and promises that the sacrifices made will pale next to the reward. However, by the end, there really isn't a reward to be had. Yes, she had successfully given Payman a physical powerful male host, but now she nor the rest of her family will be able to reap the riches she so desperately craved. Peter is now the only living member of his family and surrounded by people who don't actually love him and who only care about the demon inside of him. The audience has already seen that a new host can be chosen at any time, meaning that Peter himself is as disposable as the rest of his family. Yes, it's assumed that by the end, Peter is fully possessed by payment, but what comes next? Who in the end gets the reward? Is it to be assumed that the entire cult received their reward? And if so, why would they if Lee was the one who made the ultimate sacrifice by giving up the lives of her family? Perhaps her idea of a perfect afterlife is to walk alongside Payment, but if he is here on Earth inside of her grandson, then who is she hoping to serve in her death? Her sacrifice had been nothing more than a fulfillment of her own selfish desires. Lee died before she had the chance to face what she'd really done, and her family was the one who had to pay the price. By forcing this unwelcome inheritance on the people closest to her, she had been the direct cause of her family's downfall.